and then there'll be 20 minutes or so of questions from the audience. So please welcome to the stage Richard Dawkins. Richard, we'll start straight off with just something that Darwin talked about in Descent of Man. Has been talked about much since, the idea of the long childhood and how that gives humans such potential. And I wondered, first of all, in terms of your childhood, you've grown up to be someone who's been intrigued about the universe and the living things that we so far know within it. And I wonder how much your childhood has shaped your intrigue in the world now.
In this respect, my childhood, I suppose, is a bit longer than it should have been, because I can't really claim to have been an early developer with respect to science. I kind of drifted into the science stream at school and scraped into Oxford. I was hoping to read biochemistry, and they very wisely refused to let me read biochemistry. They said, well, we can't take you to read biochemistry. We could just about take you to read zoology. And so I snapped it up, and it was entirely the right decision. But I didn't really become an enthusiastic scientist until my second year at Oxford. And so I did rather a longer childhood than perhaps I should have done. I mean, in my second year at Oxford, I suppose I really did take off in the sense of becoming really interested in the deep questions of existence. So I never went into biology because I was a keen bird watcher or flower collector like my father, or insect collector. I was never much of a naturalist, and aspire to be a better naturalist now. But it was more the philosophical questions that interested me, beginning around the second year that I was an undergraduate at Oxford.
So Darwin, of course, has been incredibly important in shaping your mind. I think saying the theory of evolution by natural selection is, of course, such a powerful theory. And I wonder, when did you first come across Charles Darwin as a figure of science and as a man?
I think my father probably introduced me to the idea of natural selection probably when I was about 14. And I didn't really get it, actually. I mean, I'm slightly shamefaced to say that now. Well, I sort of got it, but didn't think it was a big enough theory to do the job of explaining the whole of life. And it wasn't really till I was about 16 that I grasped its full import, which is colossal.
And then your first major work, your first published work, Selfish Gene. How did that come about? I mean, I know there's the stories of the power cut and a man suddenly with time on his hands, and it led to an incredibly successful book. But I wonder what the story is behind this particular vision of evolution.
In the 1960s and 70s, there was a vogue for popular science books written by men such as Conrad Lawrence and Robert Ardrey, which got natural selection entirely wrong. And they were enormously influential because these were hugely best-selling books. And they all fell for the great group selection fallacy. They all talked about natural selection as being favoring the species or the group. And so everything an animal did was supposed to be for the good of the species. And it was that climate that led me to want to write a popular book to refute that very common error. And I'd been lecturing about that very popular error since the mid-1960s, and then finally wrote a book about it in 1975, published in 1976.
Now, a little bit earlier before we started doing this, we were talking about Bill Hamilton, and Bill Hamilton obviously was a great influence on you. He talked about this idea of looking at life from a gene's eye view. And again, I wonder if you could just tell me a little bit about the importance of when you first came across his work and how that changed your ideas.
Bill Hamilton wrote a paper in 1963 in the American Naturalist in which he introduced the metaphor of a gene which he said we will endow with a modicum of intelligence and ask ourselves, what would a gene have to do in order to preserve itself, propagate itself, and go through to future generations? That's what you mean by the gene's eye view, and it's that gene's eye view that I was later to promote in The Selfish Gene. The following year, in 1964, Hamilton wrote his most famous, it's a pair of papers, a matched pair of papers, in the Journal of Theoretical Biology, in which he took that gene's eye view, but sort of in a way backtracked from it, because what he did was to work out mathematically the function, the mathematical function, which an individual organism would have to maximize in order to maximize the survival of its own genes. And the mathematical function he came up with was inclusive fitness. So inclusive fitness is a complex, abstract mathematical quantity, which is that which an individual organism would work towards maximizing if what's really going on is maximizing the survival of its genes. And the reason for that is that it's built by the genes of its ancestors, which successfully made it through the generations. So that was what Hamilton did, and my view was that he should have stuck with his 1963 vision, which was the gene's eye view, and that was the view that I promoted in 1976 in The Selfish Gene, and really saw it from the point of view of the gene, and I used the rhetoric, I suppose you could call it, of genes, immortal genes leaping down through the generations and manipulating a succession of bodies as they go. So those bodies that we actually see, those individual organisms that we actually see, are what I called survival machines. They are complicated robotic artifacts, no, not artifacts, naturifacts, which behave as if they are machines for maximizing the survival of the genes inside them, not through any sort of foresight or anything like that, but simply because the genes that they have inherited have come down through an unbroken chain of successful ancestors, and where success means something very precise, namely success in passing on the genes that built them. And so that's why individual organisms appear to be so beautifully designed to survive, to reproduce, to be sexually attractive, to be good at parental care, to build nests and so on. Everything directed towards this one apparent goal of passing on the genes.
Now, Selfish Gene was, there was a level of controversy in the same way that people have used Darwin to go, oh, Darwin says survival of the fittest, crush everyone if you're stronger. And the Selfish Gene, when that came out, people were going, oh, I see, so they're saying we're all selfish. I mean, this was the start of your kind of, the world of being controversial. How have you managed to try and explain to people that if they haven't read beyond the title, they may well not understand the idea?
Yeah. You need to read the rather extensive footnote on the title, which is the book itself. Yes. Genes are selfish. Individual organisms may or may not be selfish, depending upon whether selfishness or altruism or cooperation or generosity or whatever it might be serves the interests of the selfish genes. The reason it's called the selfish gene is that the selfish gene is the fundamental bedrock of what's going on. Genes that work for their own survival are the ones that survive. It's as simple as that. But the route by which they survive is building bodies. And if you build a body that's good at surviving, that's a very good first step, but not at the expense of reproduction, not at the expense of survival of the genes. So if your best bet for propagating your genes is actually to die, as it might be with a species of animal where males, for example, the only way they can get their genes into future generations is by being very attractive or very aggressive, and thereby get a hell of a lot of reproduction done before they die, and probably die in the process of doing so. That's what will be favored. On the other hand, in another species, it may be that what will be favored is living for a very long time. Whatever favors the survival of the selfish genes is what will be the property of the individual organisms that are favored. Now, people who do read the book by title only assume that what I was saying was either all individuals are selfish, which I was not. Even worse, they may assume that I was saying all individuals ought to be selfish. I was actually, it's rather topical today, I was actually accused, together with John Maynard Smith, by a well-known left-wing scientist, of being responsible for the election of Mrs. Thatcher.
What is it about the theory of evolution by natural selection what do you think, what's the difficulty people have with it? Those who it seems to have, as you've discussed before, people don't seem to have such a problem with ideas of the Big Bang Theory, the idea of how the universe began, but in terms of the process of life on Earth, it seems that does create a level of vitriol. What do you think it is, and how can we get across the message that this is a more beautiful
the problems with the
story?
Big Bang and the origin of the cosmos are different. I mean, people do have very grave problems with but I mean, that's genuinely difficult. Evolution, part of the problem, I think, is the sheer time scale involved. People, you hear people say, well, I believe that evolution, when I see a monkey give birth to a human, that kind of thing. So partly they don't get the time scale, and it's very difficult to get. I mean, we're accustomed to years, centuries, have a bit of a problem with millennia. But when it comes to 1 million years, 10 million years, 100 million years, 1 billion years, we can't even begin to grasp that. So that's one problem. Another problem is that perhaps because there's been so long for it, because natural selection is such a powerful process, the illusion of design, which has been achieved in living organisms, things like the eye, which is famous, Darwin himself dealt with the problem, things like the eye, things like the heart, things like the brain, things like the cell, indeed, they are so overwhelmingly, sledgehammeringly carrying the illusion of design that people have grave difficulty in freeing themselves from the feeling that it must be designed. And I'm often curious as to why it took so long for a Darwin and a Wallace to arrive on the scene. It took until the middle of the 19th century, 200 years later than Newton, when, to my mind, what Newton achieved required really more intellect. I mean, it was much more difficult to do what Newton did than to do what Darwin did. Why did it have to wait another 2 centuries? And I think the reason may be that the intuitive power of the idea of design is so enormous that people it didn't even cross their mind that there might be a natural explanation for something as complicated and apparently designed as an eye, or indeed a body as a whole. So if somebody of the power of Newton's intellect had set himself the task of coming up with a naturalistic explanation, or indeed Aristotle set himself to the task of coming up with a natural explanation of living things, they might have got it. But somehow it probably didn't even occur to them that it was even worth looking for a natural explanation. It just seemed so obvious that it had to be supernatural.
Have you ever managed to, because I think creationists, there are 2 different kinds. I think the creationists who may well not have actually seen the facts, and then there is, of course, a broad group of political creationists. Have you ever actually managed to convince a creationist that perhaps the theory of evolution is a more accurate view of life on Earth?
I did once. We had a graduate student at Oxford from America. He came from Walla Walla College, and he was a young Earth creationist, and I'm not quite sure how he got in, but anyway, there he was, and he very conscientiously attended my lectures on evolution all right through the term. And at the end of the last lecture, he came down to the front and he thumped the desk and he said, "Gee, this evolution, it really makes sense." Now, in his case, he'd never even met it. He'd gone to Walla Walla College and he'd been taught straight young Earth creationism, and he didn't even know what Darwinism was. And so with him, it was just a matter of showing him the evidence, and his eyes were opened. but there are others who will never accept it. I mean, the most famous example is Kurt Wise, the American geologist, who after a degree in geology, I think from Chicago, and a PhD from Harvard in paleontology, still remained a young Earth creationist. And he wrote in a book called, I think, Just 6 Days, which is a collection, a compendium of essays by young Earth creationists. And he described, almost movingly actually, the story of how he had ambitions to become a teacher of science, of geology, and he had increasingly worried about the conflict between his science and his biblical training from childhood. And he said one day he got a Bible and he got a pair of scissors and he went right through the Bible, cutting out all the bits that would have to go if he accepted the scientific worldview. And then he said, at the end of this, there was so little left of Holy Scripture that it just fell to pieces. And then he said, that night, in great sorrow, I tossed into the fire. I thought he was going to say, I tossed into the fire my young Earth creationism. Not a bit of it. He said, I tossed into the fire all my hopes and dreams of becoming a teacher of science. He said, if all the evidence in the universe pointed to an old Earth, I would be the first to admit it, but I would still be a young Earth creationist, because that is what Holy Scripture teaches me. Now, that level of close-mindedness, having publicly admitted that he understands the evidence and even in some sense agrees with it, and yet is incapable of changing his mind, that is a testimony to the power of childhood indoctrination. It's shocking, it's grief-striking, but we have his testimony. Another example is a professor of astronomy. I was told this by the Oxford professor of astronomy, who said he has a colleague in America who is a professor of astronomy somewhere in America and who writes learned papers in astronomical journals filled with mathematics, all making the assumption that the universe is nearly 14 billion years old, yet he privately believes the universe is only 6,000 years old. He holds down a job as a professor of astrophysics, writes papers, gets them accepted, mathematical papers, and yet privately believes that everything he writes is nonsense. How do you deal with a mind like that? How do you deal with a mind that's capable of splitting itself into two in that way? Well, I've more or less given up trying with people like that. If I have an argument with a creationist, I'm more often than not really trying to change his mind, but I'm thinking of the other people listening in. If say there's an argument on a stage like this or on radio or something of that sort. And my target is rather more I suspect majority of people who vaguely think of themselves as religious, maybe vaguely think of themselves even as creationist, because they just haven't thought about it, haven't been interested in it. And if I can arouse their interest and show them the evidence, then it's my feeling that they'll simply see it.
Well, this is what I wondered about in terms of teaching of children. And famously, you once talked about the idea of a child being just having a faith kind of put into their mind is like a form of abuse. And my son, who's 5 and at a perfectly normal school, a non-religious school, has recently been told that, Jesus turns into bread and wine and God created, which I'm quite angry about. There will be a letter. And unfortunately, I think, as I told you, I had a long talk with him, and the other day turned to him and it's all right, Daddy, I do believe in the Big Bang after all. Not entirely sure he's got all the complexities, but it's a start. What do up to the age of 7, the famous Jesuit thing, which, in fact, in most education, that early part is a lot of it myth, fairy tale, and perhaps religious education. What can be done to try and create critical thinking from an early age when you have minds that are developing?
Yes. I don't think I ever actually said that teaching children religion is child abuse. I think I said teaching them about hell is child abuse, and I think I said that labeling children with the religion of their parents, as in, this is a Catholic child of 3, is child abuse. But I think we have to be very careful not to indoctrinate the other way. So we rightly accuse them of indoctrinating children. So we mustn't indoctrinate the other way. We must teach, as you say, critical thinking. So science which is well-established science, that's fine. That's not indoctrination. That's just education. As for teaching critical thinking, there's a lot we can do to teach children to think about evidence. For example, suppose your child has reached the age when you think it's about time perhaps she begins to question the idea of Father Christmas, and it's about time. Instead of just saying, yes, it was all a lie, there is no Father Christmas. You might think about saying, well, let's just work this out. I mean, how many chimneys are there in the world? How much time does he have to get around all those chimneys? And how fast would he have to travel from chimney to chimney in order to get all the way around the world? I mean, turn it into a sort of game like that. The idea of thinking critically, of questioning, and then you could probably do the same with lots of other things as well. And I don't see why you shouldn't do the same with turning water into wine or walking on water and things like that.
I think the current view of Father Christmas is he does it via a kind of many worlds interpretation, the breaking down of the... In fact, I have to, just a little thing with my son who just turned 5, that when he turned to me just after Christmas, he went, Dad, I know Father Christmas isn't, and then walked out. And I went, what was that? And he went, nothing. And I realised that he obviously he'd kind of worked it out, but he thought, but if I reveal that I know Father Christmas isn't real, do I lose all this stuff?
Yes.
Hang on a minute. And there's kind of... And that seems to be the battle that we have a great deal of the time, which is, at the beginning of Unweaving the Rainbow, you say, I think it was The Selfish Gene, a woman who read that, and she wrote to you and she said, life seems pointless now, and she found it very depressing. She felt suicidal,
that's right, which is terrible. But I mean, and people really oughtn't to fall into that kind of ridiculous error. And I think that's another example of the iniquity of religious education, that it leaves you hanging suspended when you finally lose. I mean, there's a lovely description in the American comedian Julia Sweeney, who's got this lovely onstage monologue called Farewell to God or something. Do you know what I want? It's not called that. It's called Letting Go God. And she describes her really rather long exodus from Roman Catholicism, ending when her mother discovered that she was an atheist, and her mother was horrified by this, and her mother said, well, I don't mind you not believing in God, but an atheist? Anyway, Julia Sweeney described when she first kind of realized that there wasn't a God, and she heard this little voice in her head saying, there is no God. There is no God. There is no God. There is no God. And then she said, but then what's keeping the world spinning round the sun? I mean, why don't we all just fall off, and why doesn't everything collapse? And oh yes, Newton's laws of motion. And her monologues kind of reflects in a rather moving way the predicament that somebody who's been brainwashed from childhood onwards finds herself in when it's taken away. It's as though the rug's been pulled out from under her. And I think it was something like that with respect to this girl who said that she was in tears and felt suicidal when she read The Selfish Gene, because the idea that there was a naturalistic explanation for life, the idea that the explanation for her own existence was as a survival machine for her genes, somehow made her life meaningless, null and void with respect to all purpose and joy and things like that. It's a horrible thought that anybody should think that. We make our own purpose, we make our own joy. And the fact that we understand why we're here in the first place doesn't detract from that, it enhances it, if anything.
Do you have any form of coping mechanism, though? Because I think it is one of the hardest things as anticipatory animals, the fact that we can look ahead and go, I'll stop at some point, I will stop. I stop experiencing, I stop existing. And I think for many people that is a very difficult thing to take on, the fact that we are finite and then we...
Yes.
And I wondered how when you first confronted that, and since then, how you deal with the idea that this will end and you will end?
I think that if there is something frightening about that, it's the idea of eternity. It's the idea, when you say, this will end, the universe will go on, the world will go on, humanity will go on, eventually it won't, eventually the sun will swallow up the earth, and eventually, whatever the physicists are now saying about the end of the universe. What's frightening is the idea of eternity. And eternity is at least equally frightening whether you're there or not. And I think it's actually rather more frightening if you're there. I think that eternity is sufficiently, the idea of going on right through to the end of the universe is sufficiently frightening that I quite like the idea of spending it under a general anesthetic, which of course is exactly what's going to happen. And the other way, of course, a much more common way to deal with it is to point out it's just the same as before you were born. And for all those ages when the dinosaurs roamed the earth, we knew nothing about it. That's what it's going to be like. And that's what it's going to be like.
Well, I mean, you spent a long period of time as looking at the public understanding of science, and of course a lot of your work is based around that. Do you find, though, I mean, I was watching Enemies of Reason, the documentary you did a few years back, and when you see people, as you were saying, that bit of the mind that doesn't allow that, however ridiculous, whatever evidence you offer to people. Well, I was watching you sitting with some psychic who was, I think, saying to you, there's someone with a G or an E, and they had cats, and you said, oh no, she hated cats. And
yes.
Well, I'm getting another thing, and you know, maybe you're blocking me, and all of this. And you kind of look at that and think, I think they really believe this. I think they believe that.
Yeah.
But also the people who then go to them, even worse, are being given these. And it doesn't matter, you know, there's famous stories of people having faith healers revealed to them as charlatans, and they go, oh, now I've got to find a new faith healer. And well, no, it's kind of, to me, sometimes I'm very pessimistic about the human outlook. And I wonder, you know...
I agree. Well, that particular example you gave of when the psychic was saying your grandmother liked cats, and I said she hated cats, that was actually a substitute, because previously we had interviewed some people called the Psychic Sisters, who had a franchise in I think it was Selfridges. It was either Harrods or Selfridges, and they had their little stall in, I think it was Selfridges. And they did psychic readings, and we went and televised them doing a psychic reading of me. So I sat down with the psychic sister, and she looked into her, whatever it was, and said, I'm looking over the other side, and I can see your father, and he wants you to know he's peaceful, and he's quite happy, and he misses you, and he's sorry he didn't have the opportunity to say goodbye, but he wants you to know that all is well. I said, well, that's nice to know. I actually had lunch with him last weekend, my father. So she sort of stopped the camera, she stopped the interview, refused to sign the release form. I wasn't exactly leading her on, I was poker facing her. The way they work, as you know, it's the way they work is they try to guess, and they try to fish for possible indications. At the time, I was in my 60s, and it was a reasonable guess that my father was probably dead. And so she kind of began with that guess. And when I didn't immediately say, oh, actually, my father's still alive, I simply said nothing and kept a poker face. She thought, okay, well, she was able to carry on with that. She, I think, was a genuine charlatan. I think she is a genuine charlatan. Her victims clearly are not. And usually the victims of these people, victims of cold reading of that sort, are people who actually want the cold reader to succeed. And so if the fishing achieves a certain little measure of success, you'll get an eager expression in the face of the victim. which reinforces the faith. And you know what they do, and they fish sufficiently, and if they miss out on C, they say, well, maybe it wasn't him who begins with C, maybe it was, I know, and maybe it was his father. Yes, and you give us a slight sort of feeling that yes, it was his father. Okay, I've skipped a generation. It was his father, that kind of thing. I think that there may be some who are genuine, some who are sincere. Most of them are just fakes.
But what is the... I mean, I think it has got... Some of them have got a lot better because of smartphones now. When you walk in, they go on Wikipedia, so it means they've got a much better reading. But I am kind of intrigued again, though, but that block of in the human mind, where you can sometimes see people who are incredibly smart, who are very well read, and they will, but we still, and perhaps all of us, perhaps many of us in this room, have certain things, certain delusions, and certain things that we believe without truly having the evidence for it. Now, that seems to me to be the biggest block in terms of human progress. That if you can offer someone as much evidence as we can accrue for an idea, and yet they can still reject it, what do we, when we look across societies and levels of civilization?
Well, I don't really have an answer to that. I think that if we could improve our education so that we don't place so much emphasis on factual information, but on techniques of thinking and the pitfalls, confirmation bias, that kind of thing, the pitfalls that lie gaping for all of us, so that people are actually trained to be skeptical of their own preconceptions and their own prejudices. The scientific method has improved itself enormously over a few centuries, not that many centuries, so that science is now a fairly well-honed tool for getting rid of as much as possible of these biases. I mean, when you think about medical research, which now almost always employs, wherever possible, double-blind controlled trials, that's actually quite recent. Because with the best will in the world, a scientist can't help being biased, perhaps in favor of his pet theory. Well, he may even be biased the other way. He may be so alive to the danger of the bias towards his pet theory that he's even biased against it. And the audience, the readers of his papers, cannot know one way or the other. But if it's a double-blind trial, then that automatically guards against that. But medical research has only pretty recently been employing double-blind trials. There's a lovely story, I think, told by Kendrick Frazier of when he persuaded a homeopath to submit to a double-blind trial. And the homeopathic medicine, of course, failed. And the homeopath said, "You see, that's why we don't do double-blind trials. They never work." We did actually, for that same program, Enemies of Reason, with Chris French, we did a double-blind test of water diviners. And there, I believe, they actually were sincere. We had a nice layout of buckets, an array of buckets which might or might not contain water. And some of them contain sand, some of them contain water. And each water diviner, each dowser came in with their little whatever it was, little rod or metal bar, whatever it was. And first of all, we allowed them to know where the water was. And their little rod infallibly said, right, so you appreciate the setup. It really works. Your hazel rod, whatever it is, really works. Yes, it really works. Okay, now we cover up the buckets. And it was truly double-blind. The person who arranged the buckets was unknown to both the dowser, him or herself, of course, and to the experimenter, who was Chris French. When the arranger had arranged the buckets, with some with water and some without, the arranger then went 100 yards away behind a tree, so there was no possibility of non-verbal cues. And every single one of the dowsers failed totally. And what was rather moving was that they were devastated. One of them was almost in tears. This has never happened to me before. I've always managed to do it before. They'd never had a double-blind trial before. And it was really, as I say, quite moving to see the obvious sincerity of their despair, actually, at having failed.
Is that ever a problem that, very briefly talk about religion, that sometimes you can take on religion in quite a full-on way? And I don't know if any of you have seen some of that stuff. But it can be, and with cognitive dissonance, it seems there is a problem, and we can see it in lots of other issues as well, climate change, for example, with James Dell in Poland, people like that, that when you tell someone they're wrong, this incredible trick happens where people believe even more that they are right. And, we see it in the newspapers all the time. Doesn't matter how many times, no, that's entirely wrong. Well, that shows how right I am. Everyone thinks I'm wrong. I must be a prophet. And do you think that maybe in some of the techniques of approaching religion that we may need to rethink some of the ways of trying to woo people away to some of the more fundamental ideas?
This is a perennial debate among me and my colleagues. How to, whether to be full on, as you say, or whether to be, whether to seduce, whether to sort of go out of your way to reach out to them. And I think actually both methods work with different people. So I think the good cop, bad cop double act can sometimes work quite well. It's commonly said, if you tell somebody you're an idiot for believing so they'll bristle so much that they'll go on believing it even more. And that probably is true of some people. I don't think it's true of everybody. For me, for example, just one anecdote, it's just an anecdote about me, but it's powerful for me. When I was an undergraduate, I read The Phenomenon of Man by Father Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. And I was captivated by this book and thought it was wonderful. And I think probably imitated his obscurantist style in some of my essays briefly. And then I read Peter Medawar's review of the book, which is surely got to be the greatest negative book review of all time. If you haven't read it, read it. It's just wonderful. Peter Medawar, P.B. Medawar, on The Phenomenon of Man. It's in all the collections of his essays, like The Art of the Soluble and Pluto's Republic. I read this book review, which was in effect telling me as an undergraduate, you're an idiot to have been fooled by Teilhard de Chardin. And I said to myself, yes, I'm an idiot. I was fooled by this obscurantist, pretentious rubbish. And I'll know better next time. Well, it worked on me. The full-on approach worked on me. It's possible that with other people, they would have, as you say, bridled so much that they would have been driven further into the arms of pretentious obscurantism. So I think maybe good cop works with some people, bad cop works with others.
In terms of, I end up doing quite a few events with what I would call kind of liberally religious people, Reformed Judaism, Quakers and Unitarians and Anglicans. And I wonder whether we need to find more common ground, whether you think there is, amongst a lot of the liberally religious people in the United Kingdom, that there are actual common goals in terms of lessening the divide between the rich and the poor and finding a better world for people, that maybe sometimes there does seem to be this division, this harsh division. I know some atheists now who will actually say, well, I know that I'm smarter than anyone who's religious. And yet I know quite a few people who are incredibly well-read, Anglicans and Unitarians, who just have this image. In fact, most religious people seem to have more doubt than I do in terms of a lot of their ideas. Do you think we might also need to find a little bit of common ground and go, well, if it's a liberal religion, or are we looking to get rid of that form of mystical belief?
I do form common ground with, for example, the former Bishop of Oxford, Richard Harris, when we're up against creationism, for example. Richard Harris and I cooperated at the time of that infamous school in Gateshead, which was teaching young Earth creationism, under the influence of, the financial backer, Vardy. And Bishop Harris and I got together and rather rapidly assembled a group of about 9 Fellows of the Royal Society and a similar number of bishops to write a joint letter which Bishop Harris and I wrote together, and we sent it to Tony Blair, who ignored it. So we cooperated on that, cooperating on humanitarian goals is another fine thing to do. Edward Wilson has written forcefully suggesting that we need to make common cause with the liberal religious people to save the world in various ways. I think there's a lot to be said for that. I would hate it to be thought that because I make common ground with them that I think there's any validity in their worldview. There is also the point which Sam Harris has made, which I think has some validity, that nice, decent, liberal religious people, in a way, make the world safe for the extreme nut jobs, because they, for example, teach that there's some virtue in faith, which means believing things without evidence. And if you're brought up to believe that faith is a virtue, that doubting Thomas, of all the 12 apostles, the one who actually wanted evidence that Jesus was alive, that somehow doubting Thomas was less worthy of our admiration than the other apostles, then you are vulnerable to becoming an extremist who takes faith so seriously that he blows up buildings because his faith tells him to. And I suspect that some of the blame for that may lie at the door of these nice, decent, liberal people who've taught children that faith is a virtue, rather than teaching children that criticism, that thinking for yourself, asking questions, looking for evidence is a virtue. So I have mixed feelings about making common cause with liberal, middle-of-the-road religious people.
Yeah, because I think it's quite interesting, the idea of the slippery slope, though I quite often see the slippery slope actually going the other way,
yes,
and towards a liberalism, but it's not about me. I mean, again, I'm intrigued. If we conceive of a world without religion, is the possibility that the human species then would be able to avoid dogma? I mean, that's the one thing that currently the main dogma which allows some terrible fundamentalist actions to occur and be used also as an alibi for hideous actions. The umbrella is religion. Now, should religions disappear, if we conceive of that, can we then conceive of a species where every individual is free thinking, critical thinking?
I mean, religious dogma is not the only pernicious and hateful dogma. Nazism, fascism, Stalinism, these are dogmas. They're not religious dogmas. Well, depends how you define religion, but they're not, at least in the case of Stalinism, it's not supernatural religious dogma. It is dogma, and it has it reinforces itself in similar ways. That followers of Stalin would say things like, the end justifies the means, and it's in the interests of the party, it's in the interests of the future of the proletariat, and some blood must be spilled. In Stalin's case, a heck of a lot of blood was spilled, and it's sort of justified because of the greater good. Now that's an equally horrible dogma. I would like to see us get rid of all such dogmas and it replaced by critical thinking again. What's the evidence? Let's sit down together and talk about the best sort of society we want to live in and talk about our values. So I would like to see the world swept clean of religion, but I'd also like to see it swept clean of these other sorts of dogmas, which can be equally horrible.
Well, that's what I wondered in terms of, from the perspective of looking at living creatures, the idea of a creature where each individual is a free thinker. Do you think, looking at the animal world, I know it's very difficult because with our level of self-consciousness, you think there is an inkling of possibility that such a human world could exist?
I wouldn't want to talk about non-human animals as having the same capacities as we have. I don't think that's what you meant.
No.
I think you probably meant knowing that we are evolved creatures, evolved for the propagation of our genes. Is there hope that we can build an enlightened, decent, civilized society? Yes, I think there is. I'm extremely impressed by the way, although not everybody is decent and civilized and humanitarian, quite a lot of us are. And Steven Pinker's new book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, looking at the broad historical sweep, makes it look pretty good to me. I mean, we seem to be moving in the right direction if you look over the centuries. Education does seem to lead to a definite improvement in living by the sorts of values that I guess most people in this room probably would wish to live by. So I would like to see the world swept clean of religion, and I think there is hope that we could build a totally non-biological, non-Darwinian society in which we could be happy.
Well, I wanted to, non-religious questions now, going back to something we talked about before, which is Darwin, who did seem to have an incredible mind of his constant interest. I mean, his last book, if you've not read his last book, which is about the formation of vegetable mould through the actions of worms, where you have a man who by then would have been 70 years old with his son playing tin whistles and bassoons and the piano to earthworms, just still intrigued by the world. And some of his phrasing, in fact, I think he's a delightful writer. He talks about his mind being a chaos of delight. I think he spent some time in a Brazilian forest on that particular occasion. But very often he talks about this chaos, this beauty, this nature shock, I think, is something. When he came back from the beginning, he had nature shock. He couldn't believe the amount of life he'd seen. And I wondered for you what remains, these moments where, perhaps in the last year, that chaos of delight at living in this universe.
Oh, enormously. I mean, all the time. And most of my books actually make attempts in various ways to extol this. The experience of, especially in the southern hemisphere and in a place where there's no light pollution, and looking up at the Milky Way and thinking about what that actually represents. And it's an astonishing thing. Looking down a microscope, looking at an electron micrograph, looking at an ice field entirely covered with penguins, as I did this last Christmas on a trip to the Antarctic. Going to Galapagos, where Darwin himself had one of his epiphanies. Yes, chaos of delight, no question.
Now, you told me a very beautiful story earlier. We mentioned Bill Hamilton briefly, and there's a new biography about him as well. But he seemed to be someone who, again, had that wonderful eye of looking at the world and constantly coming up with different theories of why certain elements of beauty existed. And you told me about, his funeral. He has been described, and I think with some justice, as the most important Darwinian since Darwin. Certainly, I think the most important Darwinian since Fisher in the 1930s. And yes, he combined a theoretical genius with the eye of a naturalist. So he had a Darwin-type eye for nature, but he had Fisher's theoretical genius as well. He had an extraordinary capacity for original leaps of the imagination. And one of the last things he did, which was an astonishing idea, was to suggest that clouds, rain clouds, might be extended phenotypes, what I'd called extended phenotypes, but he generalized it to this huge vision of clouds as being produced by bacteria or algal spores, and microorganisms of one sort or another, as survival machines to spread themselves around the world in rain. Well, this is an extraordinary idea, and there wasn't really much evidence for it, but it's a typical Hamilton piece of imagination. He also, toward the end of his life, wrote a remarkable paper called something like My Intended Burial, in which he said, when I die, I don't want to be cremated or buried. I want to be taken to the Amazon jungle and laid out on the floor of the forest with a fence around me to prevent scavengers getting at me. And burying beetles will gradually, progressively take me underground. That's what burying beetles do. And they then lay their eggs. And he had this vision of the next generation of beetles emerging from the ground where he was carried under by the previous generation of beetles. And he had this vision of a cloud
of iridescent blue wings fluttering up from his buried body, carrying him up in this cloud of iridescent blue into the canopy and then spreading throughout the canopy of the Brazilian forest. When he did die, this never happened. He is in fact buried on the edge of Whigham Wood, which is a kind of shrine of biological research near Oxford. And when the grave was still open, his great woman friend, Louisa Bozzi, knelt down and spoke very quietly into the open grave. And she said, "Bill, we couldn't carry out your wishes. Your body is not laid out in the Amazon forest. It's here on the edge of Whigham Wood. But there will come a time when the bacteria and the spore, the algal spores and the fungal spores, will carry you up into the clouds, and you'll be blown around the world in the jet stream, and eventually rain down into the forest of your beloved Amazon."
That's a beautiful story, and I think we'll stop the interview there, and we'll because I'm not sure what time it is now, so we do need to take some questions from the audience. So if you just pop your hand up, and Richard Dawkins, if you can. Where's the clock? I can't see. Oh yeah, there's the clock. Yeah. We've got 5 minutes. Oh, I'm sorry. Right, who's got a question? Would anyone like to ask a question? You've covered everything. Amazing.
Can we have the lights?
I can't see if if we have the lights up a little bit. If anyone would like to come forward to ask a question. Ah, there we are.
Margaret Thatcher died in the last few days. Ideas die. The idea of creationism may well die. The implications being that religion, or the God of classical theism and theistic religion, may die. What implications for science will that have eventually, do you think?
Well, if creationism dies, I mean, creationism, of course, already has died in the scientific, indeed the educated community. What that will mean is that science is able to get on with its job instead of having to waste its time with a sort of rearguard action against a yapping crowd of idiots.
I love seeing your gentler side. Yes.
So you've popularised the idea of the meme, which is, that maybe intellectual development might take over from genetic development or genetic evolution over time. So what do you think about ideas like the singularity and Ray Kurzweil and things like that?
I'm not going to talk about Ray Kurzweil. I mean, you asked about memes, and I don't mind saying a little bit about that. The idea of memes was originally just to point out that Darwinism works. It doesn't have to be DNA. The whole book of the Selfish Gene had been about DNA, but it would work or could work elsewhere in the universe, wherever there is self-replicating information with some kind of phenotypic power, that's to say power over the world in such a way that it influences its own chance of survival. And so the meme is the cultural analogue of the gene. There's absolutely no doubt that memes exist, in the sense that units of high fidelity do propagate themselves through human culture. That's beyond question. What's the Darwinian question is, does that give rise to evolution? Is there an actual natural selection of memes which gives rise to something equivalent to phenotypic evolution? I don't think there's any point in trying to link that to Ray Kurzweil. It seems to me to be a quite separate question.
We're going to have to draw the line there. And when I was reading Unweaving the Rainbow again, I love this D.H. Lawrence quote: "Knowledge has killed the sun, making it a ball of gas with spots." And then I immediately found some Richard Feynman, of course. Yet again, tick your box in the bingo frame. What men are poets who can speak of Jupiter if he were a man, but if he is an immense spinning sphere of methane and ammonia, must be silent. And I thought that's... I think Richard may well have... I'm not sure if he's signing books afterwards. There may well be some books outside. A few copies of my DVD with Brian Cox talk on it. He's got a lovely voice. They're outside.